If you walked into a movie theater in 1957, there's a chance you might have been greeted by a massive mantis, bursting from its prehistoric nesting place where it had lain frozen under the Arctic ice for 1,000,000 years to rain terror on the world.
I hope so. Every device of military science, every defensive weapon, radar, planes, rockets, marshaled to destroy 1,000 tons of beastly fury. A monster leaving a trail of carnage, spreading panic across a continent.
The movie The Deadly Mantis featured this huge bug on a campaign of terror, all the way from the Arctic down through North America, raising alarms and eventually climbing up the side of the Washington Monument in D.C.
Who can be sure? It may have been locked in a prison of ice millions of years ago.
And what could have released it after all that time?
The answer? Climate change. Warmth had released the mantis from the Arctic ice. The movie received poor reviews when it premiered, but the message was still there. Over 60 years later, we can still see the red wash creeping in at the edges.
Hit the alert button. Yes, sir. Operation, Colonel Parkman speaking. Condition red. Scramble all aircraft immediately. Condition red.
And The Deadly Mantis wasn't the only film that featured these Soviet-coded big bugs. The highest-grossing movie in 1954 was Them, which featured ants turned into massive monsters after being exposed to radiation.
Here is a fear-frenzied moment of suspense as mankind totters before a thing that multiplies faster than it can be killed. Here is a desperate...
Then, there's Beginning of the End, which premiered in 1957 and also features massive bugs. Their unusual growth, a side effect of radiation.
A menace so massive, so overwhelming, that thousands upon thousands are propelled into senseless terror. Panic takes the place of...
The only thing scarier than giant bugs in the 50s was communism. Today, it's climate change. Hello, and welcome to Frozen History, a podcast that tells the incredible story of Camp Century, from tensions of the Cold War to scientists in freezers, all the way to the future of our own planet. I'm your host, Mary Keuser, and I'm excited to bring you on a journey of exploration, history, science, and secrets held within the ice. If this is your first time listening, I recommend starting with episode 1, which can be found at the link in the description of this episode. You are listening to episode 2. The Cold War was the golden age of propaganda. From military films to satirical cartoons, the anti-communist message spread far and wide. In his 1999 book Mental Hygiene, Ken Smith talks about the instructional and motivational films produced during this time, saying, quote, "Carefully chosen visuals were combined with dramatic storylines, music, editing, and sharply drawn characters to create powerful instruments of mass manipulation," end quote. But behind the ad campaigns and scare tactics lay a more subtle strain of propaganda. The emphasis on all-American values was used to help build support for the United States endeavors outside of North America. Camp Century was a part of this patriotic propaganda movement. From the beginning, media coverage of the U.S. presence in Greenland was extensive and well-controlled. Any information available to the media was carefully picked from the bigger truth, filtered and censored by the U.S. and Danish forces. Thule Air Base, for example, was kept secret until the military decided they wanted the public, including the enemy, to know about it.
Here, where temperatures drop to 50 below zero and winds rise to 150 miles an hour gale force, where bright sun is abruptly succeeded by dense fog or blinding snow, American ingenuity and daring have built a new outpost in this country's defense, a giant air base on the top of the world. Now, at last, the story can be told.
The first story about Thule ran in Life magazine towards the end of 1952. The base had barely been in operation for a year. The story opens with a half-page map of routes from Thule to multiple major cities in Europe, clearly emphasizing those that lay within the borders of the Soviet Union. On the next page, ships and trucks crowded the coast near the base. To many, the images seem reminiscent of an invasion. The story fills 16 pages, with photographs that project power and paragraphs boasting of the soldiers' strengths, the modernity of their equipment, and, perhaps most apparently, their access to Soviet territory from this new Arctic base so close to the North Pole. The image of the strong and smart United States was key. Power kept the Soviet Union on its toes without actually starting a fight. Press coverage was designed to cultivate that image. So when that first story ran in 1952, featuring a map of distances from the base to the major Russian cities and a headline claiming "secret" in big screaming letters, it was absolutely not a secret. That's one of the biggest trends in the media surrounding Greenland at this time. Everything that the public learned was revealed on purpose. Everything kept secret was kept very secret, and each and every piece of media coverage was constructed to present an image. Following the Peace and Life magazine, article after article appeared in publications that reached millions of people. Science Digest, the Saturday Evening Post, National Geographic, Popular Science, and a magazine called Real, whose subtitle read, "The Exciting Magazine for Men." Its February 1955 cover, graced by a military man in a fur-lined parka, scowling and unshaven, featured the headline, "We've built a military miracle in the Arctic. Our secret base under the polar ice, exclusive." That secret base, called only Base X, was buried inside the ice sheet. Large metal tubes contained heated bunker rooms, a mess hall, and generators. Quote, "The men of Base X are known to exist within a dimension unknown to man," unquote. That dimension was the Greenland ice sheet.
Here, a hardy group of airmen beat the weather by living literally under it in a unique housing facility. Their complete living quarters are contained in metal cylinders interconnected by passageways. Originally placed on the surface, in 2 years, they have sunk into the relative warmth of the Arctic snow. Ice-cap living, something new under the snow.
January of 1956 saw an article published in Popular Mechanics, titled "Traffic Tunnels Under Greenland's Ice Cap to Supply Our Arctic Outpost." Then, in May of 1956, Collier's magazine titled their article "Subways Under the Ice Cap." This time, the message was even clearer. Quote, "In a part of the world where the land area is scarce, the ice cap subways could permit us to move major air bases much closer to the North Pole, and to a potential enemy, than is now possible. Perhaps even more important, missile launching sites could be built only a few hundred miles from the pole, sites from which even an intermediate-range missile could reach Russian bases in the Northland from the Finnish border to the East Siberian Sea," unquote. A few years later, it was Camp Century's turn. In the biggest display yet of American achievements in Greenland, Walter Cronkite visited Camp Century in 1960. As the most popular reporter of his time, of course the public would trust his reporting from Greenland, just like they did every night on the CBS Evening News.
This reporter flew out from Thule Air Force Base, the comfortable place that the envious engineers call downtown, to Camp Tuto in an Army helicopter that put us down just a few yards from a polar research heavy swing. It was all assembled, loaded, and ready for the hazardous 3-day journey out to Century, the camp on Greenland's perennial mantle of moving ice.
The 24-minute-long piece followed Cronkite from Tuto to Century, reporting on the journey out to Century.
On our way to the incredible city under the ice, traveling the most dangerous road in the world, only fuel drums and colored flags mark this man-made trail.
He spoke with Army Captain Charles Townsend about the dangers of the crevasses, those gaping cracks in the ice that frequent the margins of the ice sheet.
Tell me something about the crevasses, will you?
Oh, yes, sir. They are beautiful. And they are also dangerous. To the extent that crevasse field moves from year to year, in most areas, the movement is not real serious or not too serious. However, on the head of the Moki Glacier and in that area, and around mile 13 to 17 on the trail, they can become very tricky.
And even watched as the men exploded a crevasse in order to refill it for safety. The broadcast painted the base as a modern, comfortable city beneath the ice. The men seemed in high spirits, and their accommodations looked comfortable. In one extra special moment, Cronkite, and subsequently the rest of the United States, get to witness the moment the nuclear generator at Century fires up, making nuclear history.
In these 30 seconds, the plant goes or fails. A year and a half's work hangs in the balance. On November 12, 1960, 6:52 a.m., the conventional power plant is cut off. The atomic power plant is cut in. Electricity to light Century's 21 tunnels and 28 buildings.
Throughout the broadcast, Cronkite and the military men did speak of the dangers of the ice sheet, but even then, the scary parts seemed dominated by the power of man. Just another example of that same tailored image. Cronkite ends his broadcast with a poetic yet sobering reflection.
Men will stay behind here in their city under the ice to continue man's battle against nature, against one of the elements that in large part is still a mystery to him. He has brought his greatest scientific achievement, power from the atom, to the very top of the world. But can he live here? Can he stop the crushing force of the ageless ice? These men here will seek the answer in the months to come. This is Walter Cronkite reporting for the 20th century.
As told by the U.S. military, life in Greenland seems as enjoyable as any mountain vacation. In 1964, Skier magazine ran a story about the Glacier Ski Club. Founded by soldiers stationed at Tuto, the club was acclaimed as the northernmost ski club in the world. There's a photo of skiers being pulled up the side of the ice sheet by a snow tractor. The ski club had a patch, which you can find on eBay today, decades after it was once sewn to an army uniform. From Camp Century itself, there are photos of church services with pious, hard-working men bowing their heads before a priest on a backdrop of pure white snow. There was even a camp dog.
Mukluk, a 3-month-old Eskimo sled dog, went along as camp mascot, strictly against regulations.
Surely a life like this was something to be envied. And then there were the Boy Scouts.
One very frosty morning in late October 1960, 2 young teenagers, Soren Gregerson and Kent Goering, checked the readings at a weather station on the edge of the vast sheet of solid ice which covers most of Greenland. For the next 6 months, Soren and Kent, selected from the pick of Boy Scouting in both countries, earned their keep as junior scientific aides in one of the world's most unusual communities.
Kent Goering from Kansas and Soren Gregerson from Denmark were both 18 when they were selected to live at Camp Century from October of 1960 to April of 1961. They went through an intensive process to be chosen for this expedition. The application required candidates to submit results of a physical examination, a letter of intent, proof of academic achievement including IQ, and a 4x5-inch photo of themselves. The process was rigorous. Of course it was. Only the best could represent each country's work at Century. But of course, the experience of getting selected would be worth the extensive preparation. Instead of spending their year like their scout peers, pitching tents and tying knots, they sat under the ice, living the high life, if the newspapers of the time got it right. Photos published in Boys Life magazine show the scouts touring the facility, checking out the weather tower, the nuclear reactor, the tunnels of packed snow. There are shots of them looking at records in the Camp Century library and enjoying a steak dinner. Goering even ended up on the popular TV show To Tell the Truth after his return from Greenland.
What is your name, please?
My name is Kent Goering.
My name is Kent Goering.
My name is Kent Goering. Only one of these young men is the real Kent Goering. The other 2 are imposters and will try to fool this panel. Tom Poston, Pat Carroll, Johnny Carson, and Betty White on To Tell the Truth with your host, Bud Collier.
Well, there we have it. The votes are all in. On my honor, we have done our best to see how well we can come out with the truth in this little situation tonight, as we discover now which one of these gentlemen is the young man who lived under the ice for such a long time. So will the real Kent Gehring please stand up?
Their life in the Arctic seemed like a dream. And in a way, it absolutely was. A dream fabricated by the American military. But perhaps it was a nightmare. In reality, the Boy Scouts were miserable. The 6 months on the ice were trying. After all, they were stuck in a series of tunnels, surrounded by older guys who passed the time drinking and talking about women. I can hardly imagine a worse scenario. Soren Gregersen, the Danish scout, wrote of the American soldiers, quote, "They are made to work on just one single task during the 3 months at a time they spend here. In the US, they could go out at night. Here, they are confined to playing cards, reading, or talking in their quarters, playing billiards, going to the movie theater, which mainly shows old, lousy movies, or sitting in the library, which is not very well stocked." Herb Ueda Sr., one of the lead drillers at Camp Century, remembered the Boy Scouts and their time at camp.
So they held little contests, all right, in Denmark and the United States. And the winner of these contests would get to spend a year at Camp Century. So the joke up there was, among all the guys, was if Camp Century was first prize, what the hell was runner-up? What did the runner-up get? Purgatory?
At least the scouts knew when they'd be going home. Some of the men stationed out on the ice found it so unbearable, they up and left. After visiting Camp Century, journalist Lee David Hamilton wrote Century, Secret City of the Snows. In his book, Hamilton tells readers that in the first year that Camp Century was running, 3 men hated the camp so much, they got up and walked out of camp onto the ice sheet. The next closest base was 138 miles away, over the ice. They must have been desperate. All of them were found, returned to camp, and shipped back to the States. Some would go on to say the reason there were no firearms at Camp Century was to protect the men from themselves. But, of course, the government would never advertise this side of their revolutionary base. In fact, the Boy Scouts' thoughts didn't come out until the diary of Soren Gregersen, the Danish scout, was translated decades later. Herb Ueda Sr., the same man who joked about the Boy Scouts earlier, also recalled his arrival at Camp Century well.
There were a lot of problems. And I flew in, the following spring, and because we were starting our season, and I flew into Century, and the commander was leaving. And boy, I'll tell you, he was so happy to get out of there. He literally dragged me out of that, he grabbed me by the collars and pulled me out of that plane.
Herb Ueda Sr. was part of another interesting group in the Arctic, the minorities, of which there were few. As a Japanese American, Ueda spent 3 years in an American internment camp in Idaho during World War II. 15 years later, he stood amongst mostly white scientists and soldiers as he drilled into the ice at Camp Century. While the military was moving towards desegregation following Truman's 1948 orders, it was moving slowly. Though there were a number of black soldiers stationed in the Arctic, they were left out of the narrative time and time again. Crawford Henderson was an engineer for the U.S. Army. In 1963, he won an award for his mechanical snow trimmer, a tool that would save hours of tedious manual labor that had been used to keep the tunnels of Camp Century open in the past. Henderson was the lone black man at Century when he was testing his trimmer. However, the only photo of the work showed a white soldier pushing the machine along, without even a mention of Henderson. Considering that the first person to stand on the North Pole was likely a black man named Matthew Henson, one would hope there might be more diversity in polar science. However, it was still the 60s. Another scarcely recorded group in the Arctic was women. According to camp legend, they told new arrivals on the glacier that there's a girl behind every tree in Greenland. In case you've forgotten, there are no trees in Greenland. But the women, too, made their mark in the cold. Oliver Jean Drummond, was an Army man who served at Camp Century between 1959 and 1960. He came back with stories of 2 women who left a mark on him and on the base. The first woman was an engineer. She spent 3 days at Camp Century studying the nuclear reactor after it failed to successfully start. According to Drummond, she kept to herself, sitting at the same table each day with paper, pencils, and a slide rule. At the end of 3 days, the base commander tried to order the woman to stay, but she handed him a to-do list and called a helicopter to take her home. Since she was a civilian, the base commander had no authority to keep her there. It turned out not to matter, according to Drummond, as after the to-do list had been completed, the reactor started back up and worked as designed. The second woman was a Danish veterinarian. She would travel around Greenland for much of the year tending to the native Greenlanders' sled dogs. Drummond recalls that when the vet visited Camp Century, she refused to stay in the warm lodgings with the others. Instead, she dug a small cave into the snow outside the camp and slept there, surrounded by her sled dogs to keep warm. Chances are, she was at Century to check in on Mukluk, the camp dog, and vaccinated him following an outbreak of rabies that had traveled from the Arctic foxes to the sled dogs in Greenland. Drummond's stories of these women break the exclusively male narrative that pops up in nearly every account of Camp Century. However, the names of these 2 women are lost to history. Just one example of the erasure that the media of the time leaned into. Of course, the stories of these people are few and far between, but that means they are especially important to tell. The US military invited the media to Greenland specifically to paint a positive image of the Arctic, and what a great job the US was doing there. When it came time to share the story of Camp Century, the focus was the white men who worked and lived there. To the public, everything was going exactly as planned, and everyone was happy to be a part of this world-changing endeavor. But the truth was more complex. The Danish scout Søren Gregersen wrote an article for Danish newspaper Politiken in November of 1960. His opening lines give us a glimpse of the true mood on base. Quote, "This is a horrible, desolate place. At least, that's the general opinion and the daily topic of conversation among the Americans here. In a way, I do understand their point of view." Unquote. To the public, Camp Century was advertised as a research base. The base was filled with scientists and researchers working day and night to unlock the secrets of the ice. They measured the weather, they collected samples, and they ran experiments, straining micrometeorites from the ice, studying lead pollution from cars thousands of miles away, monitoring fallout from atomic bomb tests, all under the guise of progress, military superiority, and of course, Project Iceworm. The core drilling, however, was the most impactful research that happened at Camp Century. Soon, revolutionary information would come from nearly a mile of ice, a Rosetta Stone of climate history. But the frozen soil was lost and forgotten. Then, decades later and thousands of miles away, the history frozen in that soil would be revealed, and it would change how the world thought about Greenland and its ice sheet. Stay tuned for episode 3, where we dig into the ice and the frozen soil alongside the scientists working at Camp Century, and find out what secrets and knowledge the first deep ice core shares with us today, and what it means for the future of our warming world. This episode was researched, written, and produced by me, Mary Keuser, with extensive help from Paul Bierman and the Camp Century team at the University of Vermont. If you'd like more information, including links to the extensive research the team did and published, head on over to our website at campcentury.org and find us on Instagram at campcentury.fossilsundeриce. For an even deeper dive into the story of Camp Century, its science, and people, check out the book When the Ice is Gone, published by W.W. Norton. This material is based upon work supported by the U.S. National Science Foundation, under award number OPP 2114629 and EAR 1735676 and 2300560. As always, thank you for listening, and we will see you next episode.